Hey guys, so I chose standardized English for the form of dialect I'm going to go over. I feel a little bit advantaged in picking that since it is, the standard, which I'm going to go over here. As far as a brief history of that, the research that I found, it seemed like it went back as late, or excuse me, as early as about 1712, where a man named Jonathan Swift, excuse me, proposed a correcting, improving, and ascertaining of the English tongue. And without these standards, we would lapse into linguistic anarchy. So essentially, he was saying, hey, there's a lot of different variations of the English language. We need to get together and decide on a standard, um, a set standard, something that we can agree is correct, so we can decide that everything else deviates from this. So it's English that is valued at a certain standard. It's an institutionalized standard. It emphasizes clarity and uniformity. Um, I guess what you'd consider like professional English or tuxedo English, as Professor Hickson calls it, if you've ever taken a class with her. Basically, formal tuxedo. Uh, you've got formal versus informal, tuxedo English versus t-shirt English, professional English versus, I guess, non-professional, non-standard. So it's the standard. Um, and it emphasizes clarity and uniformity. That's pretty much the definition, along with the brief history there. The main features to kind of go along with that definition, of course, is having your nouns and your verbs clearly agree, clearly enunciating every word that you say. This is things like, fully pronouncing the ing on every word, like, walk in versus walking, eaten versus eating. So it's enunciating each syllable and making it clear that every letter in that word is there for a reason. So it's, I guess socially it's considered lazy to not do that. So speaking standardized English is essentially not being lazy and saying everything the way it's supposed to be properly said. Um, Socially, it is considered kind of the language of the educated. It's considered to be spoken by people who have an education or who have a particular propensity to pay attention to the speech that they are using. So, in that way, it's almost considered the socially superior language, or it's got, there's room there for it to be considered that. Because again, it's kind of the language they're expecting you to speak in the professional world. I feel that as far as classroom implications go, if you've got students who are already familiar with standardized English or fluent, I guess I could say, I feel that they are sort of at a bit of an advantage because that is the language they're going to be expected to speak in the professional world. And if our job as educators is to prepare our students for the real world, as they call it, or the professional world, they're already there. They already know it. They maybe what they speak at home. That can imply about their background. They may have a better upbringing than some people who don't speak that language that well, or that form of English at all. There's clear deviations from standardized English when you get into Southern English and other types of English, African American English. Um, you know, One of those things like you all versus y'all, they mean the same thing. If you speak English, you probably know that they mean the same thing, but y'all is Southern, you all is standard. There's an interesting stigma there that those who deviate from standardized English they're viewed as less educated. Socially, there's a bit of a stigma. That's not always true. In my classroom, I would like to use that to my advantage and sort of create an activity out of it, and explain to the students, here's y'all, here's you all. What do these mean, right? Why are they different? You may hear this one, you may hear this one. Um, don't judge people who don't speak the same way as you do. Understand that you're all speaking English. There's just so many versions of English. And if there can be this many versions of English that are difficult to stipulate from, imagine how hard it must be being a non English speaker and having to not only learn English, which version of English are you learning, right? And then you have to master English before you can even understand that there's different forms of English. And I think that's a very eye opening activity for children, to really understand just how vast the language is that they speak and how many of their friends and peers can be speaking the same language as them, but a different form of that language. It's very eye-opening, and maybe hopefully kids will understand that they are privileged if they already speak American standardized English, because that's what they're going to be expected to speak as adults, and they can thank their parents for instilling that into them. Um, as far as the stigmas, though, like I said, I feel that their students are at an advantage if they already speak standardized English. They don't have to worry about being viewed as inferior at all. They're just considered standard, the norm. They already speak the norm. They don't have to work any harder. And I think this would be an excellent way for those who don't already speak the standardized English to employ like a code switching curriculum. If I had a student who spoke Southern or African American English or had a tendency to not speak the standardized English, code switching could be employed as like a, hey, that Southern English, we'll call that your home language. The standardized English, we are going to call that your, school language. Appropriate language versus inappropriate language instead of good language versus bad language. Standard versus non-standard versus good versus bad. School versus home instead of good versus bad. So to understand that there's a time and a place, and that standardized English tends to be the time and place in a professional environment. In my research, I did find what I thought was interesting. There's consistently been a push for standardized English to be dubbed the kind of official English of the nation. I mentioned that in 1712 was back when we first had the sort of demand for proper English or standard English. 2003 seemed to be when the term standardized or idealized, as they call it, language, which was only 16 years ago. So within the last 2 decades, there's been kind of a re-emergence of really narrowing down what is the standardized English. And then as late as 2018, there was an interest again in trying to push for it to be the true standard. So it is recognized as a standard, but nothing that is legally enforced. It's more of a stigma than anything else, but it's a stigma that affects a person's ability to flourish and succeed in the professional world, in the real world, as they call it. So that's what I've got about standardized English. I feel that a lot of us probably inherently speak standardized English and may not be aware that we are at an advantage already just by being fluent in that form of English. I look forward to hearing more from you guys' posts. Thank you.